Hi, everybody. So, uh, if you're watching this when it first debuts Tuesday the 12th, I'm currently at my local club, the Greater Seattle Aquarium Society, giving a talk. And normally we'd have our live stream, but instead I wanted to do a small question and answer session based on a few kind of common questions that I tend to get, whether it's via email or through comments, and just answer those. And please let me know in the comments down below if you like this kind of as a live stream replacement, or maybe we should try something else. If you have an idea, please give me some suggestions. It'll only happen like once a month when my club is having meetings, which isn't every month. So, we'll have little replacements every once in a while. And I thought maybe this would be a good idea. Something we could potentially just ask the community questions or what have you and put together a recorded video. So with that being said, let's get into it. All right. So first question. Bam. This is from Monique. Hello, Bentley. Happy Labor Day weekend. You can see when this came in. But this is a question I get relatively often, is questions like this. And I have a very quick question. Can I keep a Bristlenose Pleco and a mystery snail in a community tank? Thank you so much. Of course. So we have to pay attention to a few things. We want to make sure that the Bristlenose and the mystery snail, or mystery snails if we want more than one, get enough food. Mystery snails, narrate snails, snails in general eat a lot more food than we think. And there are certain people who've lost a lot of snails because they didn't realize exactly how much food those guys need. So the big thing would be using things like your Repashy or algae wafers, if you don't have a lot of algae in your tank, that is, or some kind of bottom sinker, extremes sinking wafers. There's a lot of like bottom feeder foods. Bug Bites, Fluval has their own bottom feeder formula. They also have a Pleco formula. You could use stuff like this. I think honestly, Repashy is one of the best. Both Soylent Green and Community Grow are amazing, depending on whether you need more protein or whether you need more algae. Yeah, that's about it. And the other thing with mystery snails specifically, they need calcium not only in the water but in their diet. And this applies to pretty much all invertebrates, but snails especially. We'll often think, we got to have calcium in the water to protect their shells. But if they don't have calcium in their diet too, they cannot maintain and create those shells very well. So it's important that we get calcium in the diet too. So what I mean by that is you could do things like some of the homemade recipes like snail jello, and there's like a million recipes for that. If you look it up on YouTube, you'll find different ones. My favorites that have been done were by Jadrin Aquatics, and I think Irene over at Girl Talks Fish also did one. But there's a lot. The last time I looked this up, there were a ton of recipes. But basically, this is a way to add calcium into your own Repashy style food, and it can be extremely healthy for your fish, not only the snails. So look into that. Mark, good afternoon. I came across a pic of your guppies the other day, or video. This is what I get this all the time. But looking forward for a way to acquire some. Are you still selling pairs or trios? Yes and no. So, yes, there are ways to get my guppies. I sell them through Redfish Bluefish, which is my friend Jason's store. He does online shipping, so you can just go to redfishbluefish.shop, and we'll have a link that'll come up here directly in the thing. It'll show you like a page, and I'll have a link in the description of this video for you. But yes, and for those curious who are watching this, yeah, I've already answered all these questions to these people, but for the purpose of the YouTubes. But yeah, I sell them pretty regularly through him. We do it by pairs, and we kept the pairs at his shop price at the same price that I would sell them as if I was shipping them direct to you. So basically, I deliver fish, or Jason comes directly to my house and picks them up. We do this semi-regularly, about 3 or 4 times a year. He's typically getting fish right now. It kind of depends on how busy he is versus how busy I am. And we try to make them available as frequently as is feasible for our schedules. So for that, you can go to redfishbluefish.shop. You can look for the Blue Hawaiian Moscow. You'll see there from the Bentley Pasco collection, which is, it always gives me a little grin because it's a collection of one. And then if you do, there's a discount code for your fish to save a little money on your fish. Use Stay Awesome in your cart. It will save you 10% on your fish at Redfish Bluefish. If you get more than just my guppies, it will save you on those too. Bam. This is way easier than live stream. From Jason. What would be your substrate mix? Growing a lot of crypts under an aqua sky. Thanks. Can't get the Rio, and this is for Rio Escuro stuff in the UK, which Escuro gets often given all sorts of auto corrections, so I've seen a lot of random ones. I get this a lot. It's like I did the substrate 101, and lots of people want to know exactly the substrate I use, and it changes from tank to tank. I've tried a lot of different things. In general, what I like is one of your bigger kind of aqua soils, right? So whether that's ADA Amazonia, whether that's UNS Contra soil, Fluval stratum, if you can get Brightwell's Rio Escuro, all of these types, right? There's a lot of them. Tropica has their soil, etc., etc. Any of the clay or volcanic ash-based small ball type substrates and nutrient-rich substrates. I like mixing those with something like Echo Complete. You could also use Seachem Fluorite, depending on your needs. So like if you're using crypts, I would suggest having some kind of laterite in there, whether that's fluorite red. Again, Brightwell has their own laterin substrat, which is pretty good for getting laterite, but extra iron for crypts specifically is great. In general, I like kind of either the mix method where you just mix everything together, or the lasagna method where you do it in layers. It's all about what you're trying to grow. In the case of crypts specifically, I would do the lasagna method. So I would do a layer of whatever that nutrient-rich substrate is, in the middle Echo Complete, above that more nutrient-rich substrate. So the goal here is to have something that's a little more porous, but not as nutrient-rich, to have kind of a middle layer, and you want it thin, right? You want a majority of it to be your nutrient-rich substrates, right? But to have that so that you can establish really, really healthy root systems and grab onto everything, which that more porous material makes that super easy. Also, it's a little finer in some cases, so it can grab on really well. And you could do this with like a gravel if you wanted some kind of decorative gravel over the top or something like that. Easy peasy. You can go with just your ADA, Contra soil, whichever one you get. That's perfectly fine. That's actually really good for crypts and most plants in general. You don't have to have the mixture. But typically I use a mixture of both because I like getting some of the small benefits that come from each of those substrates. And if you haven't seen it, check out Substrate 101. That'll give you a lot of details as to what's going on there. From DIY Enthusiast. Hi, Bentley. I just have a question for you. If red is the most important for plants, this is talking about light spectrum, why do you have less red than white on all of your Fluval 3.0 settings? I don't know if it's a silly question. I'm a beginner. Thanks. Good question, actually. So red is the most important if we're talking about individual colored LEDs. But in the case of having white light, where it's in a compass of all of the spectrum in one LED, we're providing red at the same time we're providing everything else. I would argue the most important light overall is actually your white light, bright white light. So that kind of like, if you're looking at Kelvin, that's at between 5600 and 6500 Kelvin, the daylight spectrum portion of white, because that's the best mix overall, or a slightly warm white. So something like 4000, 4500 Kelvin, where it's ever so slightly yellowish tinted to our eyes. Those are the best overall light spectrums and light colors, if we're going to think about color, right? But that's within the PAR, the photosynthetically active radiation wavelength areas. So there's a band of wavelength basically that matters the most. Those are the most important. They create white light, but in there's blue, there's green, there's yellow, there's orange, so all that kind of stuff. Red's just the best single color LED. So white's actually more important than red in the grand scheme of things. But if you're going to do colored LEDs of an individual color, you want to shoot for the more red tones. And this can be orange or even yellow light. Green light can be extremely effective as well. Just in general, try to keep your blue a little low, because blue tends to cause additional algae, especially blackbeard algae off of LEDs in a lot of our aquariums. From BB23, what heater wattage would you recommend for a 40 breeder? So it really depends on the temperature you're trying to get to. If you're trying to get super hot, You're going to want higher overall wattage than if you're trying to stay in like that 72 to 76 range. Most tropical tanks tend to be in that 72 to 76 range. And in that case, I would look at like 2 100-watt heaters. That way, if one goes out, you have a backup. And if one sticks on, it's not so powerful that it can get your way out of your temperature range, get super, super hot, and end up frying your fish. If you don't want to do 2 heaters, maybe you've only got 1 plug-in, or you're trying to save a little bit of money and buying 2 slightly smaller heaters and spending an extra $10 or whatever it may be is not feasible right now in your budget, get a 200-watt. If you're trying to go a little higher, you want to go like 83 to 86, so you're kind of discus, German blue ram, I would look at like 300-watt at that point. And that way you don't have to crank it quite as high on the individual smaller heaters to still get really strong temperature. But it really depends on one, the quality of the heater you get. You get a really cheap heater, I would get multiple. I would get multiple small ones and play it safe. Then if you get a really high quality heater, you can usually be pretty okay with just one and just set it up correctly. From DJI Phantom, you're a drone. Roofless tank suitable for a rainbow fish. I'm assuming you mean a tank without a lid. No. So rainbows tend to jump, especially when they're eating. They get really, really boisterous. They like zip toward the surface really fast and often will send themselves flying. They don't always mean to, but they do. So it's really common to get rainbow fish to jump out of your tank. So one of the things that we prevent this with is a lid. Now, can you have a tank without a lid or only a partial lid in rainbows? Yes. If you're going to do this, I would highly suggest you keep your water level lower than the top. You don't always fill it up to the top. But if you're going for like a rimless, look at something like one of the screen nets that you can temporarily put over the top. And then if you're doing like photography or some of your work, you can take that off and be okay. But just in general, I would suggest lids for rainbows or keep the water level low. And I'm talking like this far down, several inches from the rim of the tank to make sure that if they do go a little too excited over food and they kind of hop out of the water a little bit, they're not flying out of the tank on you. Because I've had that happen a few times and it's a mad dash panic and you don't want to go through that. Trust me, you don't want to go through that. And finally from Bob Purcell, thanks for another great stream. And at what point do I need to worry about too much CO2 with fish? Is there a need to check CO2 occasionally, like nitrates and other parameters? So, at the point in which they start gasping for air, is when you need to worry. So, in general, I would say this really depends on how well you oxygenate your water. So, if you're adding lots of extra oxygen or you have lots and lots and lots of movement at the top of your water, so you've got that nice churn going at top that creates the gas exchange to get extra air into your water for your fish, you usually don't need to worry too much. As long as you have a good regulator, right? The big thing is a nice dual stage regulator prevents that like end of tank gas off. Higher quality ones will maintain your pressure and your needle valve staying at the same rate the whole time. That's really critical. I would say if you know your bubble count, like you can just look and see like I'm going at 3 bubbles a second, roughly speaking. And you just look at that every time you're by your tank and just make sure you're probably okay. Now this is where a drop checker can come in handy for those who really want to be extra paranoid. I don't use drop checkers, but you certainly can. Having a drop checker in your tank will give you an idea of whether you're oversaturating your water with CO2. You really don't need to go higher than 30 ppm, but I do know several like high-end crazy plant people who push a lot of CO2 in their aquariums. And they keep very minimal fish in those tanks. I want to keep that in mind. But if you're trying to do a higher stocking of fish, I would keep your CO2 low. Try to sit in that like 20 to 25 ppm range, maybe even only 20 to like 15 to 20, right? It's okay to go slightly lower on CO2 if you're not doing like really crazy plants. You can check in other fashions, so that's like using a liquid test kit. You can combine, you can check the carbonate hardness and the pH at the same time. That gives you a rough ppm of CO2 in your water. There's a conversion chart that you can find online for this. But in general, what I would say is if you're adding lots of extra oxygenation, whether that's through sponge filters, through air stones, you have some kind of oxygen reactor in your sump or whatever, if you're trying to hide your equipment, it's inline, like you would do inline CO2, you probably don't need to worry too much. With that being said, if you naturally keep your CO2 low, where you only say 2 to 3 bubbles per second in like a 40-gallon breeder, or you're 2 bubbles a second in a 29-gallon, or 1 bubble a second in a 10-gallon, you don't really need to worry. It's not enough CO2 to cause an issue. But if you're trying to push like really high CO2 levels, like those super crazy ADA, I'm keeping all the rarest plants ever. I've got Ludwigia white, and I got this, and I got that, and I got all this crazy nonsense. I got this one stem that's only been collected once in 2009, or those kind of like crazy train tanks that you'll see every once in a while. And you're going real high levels of CO2 to keep all this stuff active and healthy and alive, because maybe it's not meant to be submerged at the whole time. Then it's going to really matter about your flow and your gas exchange at the top to help make sure that there's some water getting repopulated with oxygen, right, and letting some of that CO2 out over time. Because if you're pushing a lot of CO2 in, you don't need to like trap it in by still water up top. You can churn a little bit and be okay. And then extra oxygenation, whether that's from an air stone, sponge filter, what have you. I would say just pay attention. Drop checkers can do a lot for you. And this is the case where I would say having a drop checker is good if you're going a little higher on your CO2 and you want to make sure you're not going too high. But in general, I just look at my regulator. I have a little bubble counter that's on there, and I keep mineral oil in it so it doesn't evaporate, and it allows me to just spot check every day. And as long as that pace is the same day to day, when I check, and I check my tanks twice a day, it's fine. It's fine. Don't have to worry about it. Like I said, if you keep your CO2 a little lower, you're not going like really crazy. It's really easy to just spot eyeball check it every day. You don't need anything too fancy or extra equipment like that. If you do see something where like the fish are gasping at the surface, that's when you need to panic. You do a big water change immediately. If you don't have an air stone in here, you throw one in temporarily just to make sure. But as long as you're adding extra oxygen, it's really hard to push so much CO2 that it becomes problematic. Yes, you can, but at that point, your CO2 is almost wasted because it's probably more than the plants can realistically utilize. All right, so that's the last of our questions. Oh, it's all the YouTube beggar things like, comment, subscribe, please share with all your friends and family. The usual algorithm thing, right? If you enjoyed this, please give it a like. Let me know in the comments down below, did you like this as a replacement for our normal Tuesday live stream where we're still kind of getting a question and answer? Should we do more like this where we set up specifically a community post to collect questions and answer them on the live stream replacement video? Things like that. This is what I want to hear down from you guys in the comments. Again, if you did like it. If you have a question here you think would help a friend, or maybe you saw a friend who got their question answered, share it out to him. Let him see it. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. And stay awesome.